There's been a lot of talk about Bidenomics, folks. Joe Biden trying to tout his economic accomplishments, his economic record, and we've been saying forever on this show, and most people in the chat have been saying, most people in most chats, most commentators in this space have just been wondering what the hell you're talking about, because the lived reality of people in this country is quite dismal, to put it mildly. And here the Washington Post reports, along with several other outlets, this was a couple weeks ago now, U.S. poverty spiked in 2022, reversing gains, Census Bureau data shows. U.S. poverty spiked last year, with child poverty more than doubling, the U.S. Census Bureau reported Tuesday, while the proportion of people lacking health insurance in 2022 dropped to an uncommonly low level. The figures reflect the uneven pace at which the government has ceased some forms of coronavirus pandemic assistance, as well as the calamitous effects of record inflation on household finances. Tuesday's data offers the first statistical snapshot of how the winding down of such programs, as well as rising prices, have begun reshaping the country. The poverty rate, taking into account government aid programs to the poor, was 12.4% in 2022, up from 7.8% the previous year, the census data shows. That spike follows 2 years of declines and coincided with the end of increased child tax credit payments and other government interventions. Tuesday's census data also noted a 2.3% drop in median household income from $76,330 in 2021 to $74,580 in 2022. Real median earnings for both part-time and full-time workers also dropped last year by 2.2%, although incomes grew slightly for the lowest paid workers. The data also showed that 65.6% of working women worked full-time jobs year-round in 2022, the largest share on record. Before Tuesday's data release, experts had been expecting a jump in the national poverty rate. The main question was the size of that increase because of the competing effects of an improving labor market and record inflation. The numbers reflected the impact of those higher costs. So you see there, it says 65.6% of working women worked full-time. We hear all about the unemployment rate being low. And what have I said for as long as we've had a show? For those of you who have been watching or listening for a while, going way back to the audio days, I've always said this since I was a kid. I said this. The employment rate or the unemployment rate is a red herring. Employment numbers do not matter if the jobs do not pay enough to live. What matters is inflation, what matters are wages, and what matters ultimately is the poverty rates. And so now you're seeing data reflect that this economy has gotten worse since Biden took over, since the lockdowns ended, not better, which is a pretty astounding thing. But not surprising, given the fact that we all go to the supermarket a few times a week. We all know what things cost. We all know what we're making at our jobs. All of this data was hidden in plain sight. It's just the elites don't see it because they don't bother looking. And a couple weeks ago, it was expected that this report would drop. And you saw a couple of outlets say Biden administration prepares for bad news on poverty rate. Well, turns out they didn't really have to answer for it because the media never makes them answer for it, right? If you watch MSNBC, if you read the New York Times or CNN, they make hardly any mention of this. Hardly any. This came and went in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago. How many segments have you seen on TV about this? On any of the major networks? Has Biden been forced to answer for this? Not that I've seen. You know, these are the kinds of issues that just don't get the kind of coverage that they should, because these media outlets are not patronized by poor people. That's why. Right. That's why. And so on top of this, there was a new Washington Post poll that came out this morning that showed Trump up by 9 points, as one of our super chatters just mentioned, 51 to 42. In that same poll, the question was asked, what is your personal financial situation compared to the start of Biden's term? Are you better off, about the same, or worse off than you were at the start of his term? And look at those numbers. 44%, not as well off. 39%, about the same. Only 15% of respondents said they were better off than the beginning of Joe Biden's term, which, keep in mind, the beginning of Joe Biden's term is when everyone was locked in their houses and the economic future of the world was extremely uncertain. And only 15% of people in this poll said they're better off than they were then at such a hopeless time. 83% of respondents say they are about the same or worse off than they were in the heart of the pandemic lockdowns. That's amazing. That is amazing. And that, in any year resembling a normal election year, spells certain doom for the incumbent. And I would say it spells certain doom now, because unlike 2022, when Biden could basically lean on the Roe ruling to garner support for his party in the midterms, this is a different election where you don't just have the legislative branch up for grabs. You have the executive, which is why Russell's theory could be right, which is it'll be a split call where, because of the abortion issue and the uncertainty around that, Democrats may win certain House and Senate races that they wouldn't have won had it not been for Dobbs. But that executive race could go the other way. So you could have a split ruling, because it just seems impossible that he is in any shape to win given these numbers. 83% same or worse off than they were at the end of the world, basically, when everybody thought the world was going to end. So anyway, I'm sorry, that was long, but go ahead.
No, not at all. One interesting thing in that poll was that when Donald Trump left office, it was something like, somewhere around 32% had a positive view of his presidency, and now it's 48% have a positive view of his presidency, because they got to look at what happened afterwards.
Exactly, yeah.
By Trump was a tough act to underperform, but Biden seems to have managed it. You got this shaky, cognitively impaired old man with a reptile vice president who creeps everybody out every time she speaks. That doesn't fill the country with confidence. A fucking South American style strongman looks pretty good now after getting a good look at the alternative. Did they do anything about, look, this inflation was largely caused by price gouging. That's what happens when you basically have 6 corporations manufacturing everything you buy in the fucking supermarket. If you really boil down all these products, they all come from like 6 corporations, like Nestle, Unilever, Johnson & Johnson. It's like 6 corporations that just raped everybody, took advantage of the pandemic. Remember, they talked about, they're going to investigate. What happened? They didn't investigate, because the Republicans are not going to investigate big corporations, and neither are the Democrats. So they got to inflate those prices for no reason. And they were going to put them back down now that they're getting away with it. It's just another step in the extraction of the wealth of the working poor and the middle class.
Please clap.